Once upon a time, not so very long ago, long enough ago that you might remember it just as clearly as if it was yesterday, there was a sprite. Now, you might be wondering what a sprite is, but I can tell you what a fairy is. A fairy is a sprite that is all grown up. And so, hopefully that explains to you what sprites are. They just haven't grown up yet. And this sprite in our story tonight is named Jem. Now, Jem was not quite like the other sprites. You see, sprites and fairies generally can fly. They are born with wings, and they're very good at flying from a very young age. But Jem had a wing that was not formed like other fairies and sprites' wings. And so they couldn't fly like the other fairies and sprites. Now, when Jem was a very young sprite, this was not such a great trouble because their caretakers just carried Jem around in little pouches on their backs. Caretakers are like parents for fairies and sprites. So the caretakers would carry Jem around and they would try to help them play with the other spritelings. But it was difficult for Jem to do this because the other sprites were put off by Jem having to be carried around, and sometimes they made fun of Jem, and sometimes they ignored Jem, and sometimes they were fine with it and they played nicely and it was all good. But Jem got very tired of being different from the other sprites, and so when they got old enough to start telling the caretakers what they wanted, over time they gradually began to ask more and more to just stay at home and play quietly by themselves, which worried the caretakers a great deal because everybody needs friends. But they let Jem do what they wanted to and just worried quietly to themselves. Now, Jem still missed playing with the other spritelings. And one of the things that Jem thought was that it would be much easier if there was some way for Jem to climb up and down easily. You see, sprites and fairies live at the tops of flowers and bushes and things like that in gardens. They have little houses among the flowers. And Jem felt very trapped sometimes because it was hard to get down from their house to the ground or up to another fairy's house, or to run around and play hide and seek among the bushes. So Jem thought a great deal about this, and one night at dinner, they said to their caretakers, "Excuse me, I've been thinking thoughts for some time now." And the caretakers were like, "Well, what have you been thinking?" And Jem was like, "Oh, I've been thinking, are there any creatures that go up high in bushes and flowers and trees and such without wings?" And the caretakers looked at each other and they thought about it. And one of them scratched their chin a little bit and said, Well, there's climbing things like, and they shuddered, spiders. Now, Jem knew that spiders were not good news for fairies and sprites. Spiders and fairies and sprites are enemies. They do not get along very well. Sometimes the fairies and sprites go to the spiders and try to get them to answer questions and give them advice, because the spiders are very wise and tricksome. But the spiders try to trap the fairies and sprites and eat them all up. So Jem did not really want to be like a spider, but they were curious because they did want to climb up and down. So they asked, how do the spiders climb up and down? And the caretakers said, oh, well, they have little claws and they use webs, sticky webs. And Jem was like, could I get claws and sticky webs? And the caretakers looked a little taken aback. They weren't expecting their Jem to want to be like a spider. And Jem was like, I don't want to be like a spider. I just want to be able to do what spiders do. And the caretakers thought about it for a minute and realized that they didn't want to let their prejudices against spiders get in the way of Jem being happy. So one of them looked at the other two and was like, I don't know. I've never heard of a fairy or a sprite with claws and webs, but maybe we could figure something out. And the other two looked at the caretaker, and then all three of them thought about it for a minute, and one of them finally spoke up and said, you know, she might be able to help. Oh, said the other two. Oh, yes. Yes, she might be able to help. That's a very good thought. And they studied each other for a minute and then looked at Jem and then talked among themselves for a minute. Finally, one of the caretakers looked at Jem again and said, Jem, how would you like to go on a trip tomorrow to see an old friend? And Jem was like, do I have to go in the pouch? And the caretaker said, I'm afraid that might be the only way to do it. It is a very long trip, and I have to fly very high up some of the time. But I might get claws and webs, said Jem. Yes, you might get claws and webs, but I'm not sure. We're going to try our very best, said the caretaker. Okay, said Jem. I mean, at least I won't have to ride in the pouch forever. So it was that the next morning, the caretaker and Jem got up very early, and the caretaker put on the pouch, and Jem crawled inside, and they took off into the bright, bright blue sky. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining, and the birds were singing, and it was very glorious all around. Jem found that they weren't even too grumpy about riding in the pouch because it was so beautiful, and they could poke their head up out of it and let the wind blow through their hair, and it was really lovely. The caretaker was happy and excited because they thought maybe they would have finally gotten a way for Jem to have more happiness and things to do in life. And so they flew along quite merrily until at last the caretaker pointed down in front of them, down, down, down to the ground. And there, when Jem looked, they saw a hill. A tiny, tiny, tiny green hill. The littlest, greenest hill you ever did see. And the caretaker flew down out of the sky and landed on top of the hill. They knelt down and let Jem crawl out of the pouch. And then Jem put their hand in their caretaker's, and they started walking down the hill. It was not a very long walk, not even for such a little creature as a fairy and a sprite. And when they had come to the bottom of the hill, they found a door. The littlest, greenest door you ever did see, in the littlest, greenest hill that you ever did see. And they knocked on the door. "Who's there?" said a voice from the inside. "It's me," said the caretaker, "and Jem. I brought them to visit you." "Oh my gosh, I'm so excited," said the voice from inside, and the door thumped open with a great kaboom. It made an awful lot of noise for such a small door. Jem stared up at an old, wrinkled fairy. Very, very wrinkly and old and beautiful. And Jem was enchanted. This fairy looked like they had spent their whole life smiling. And their face was very lovely to look at as a result. "Come in," said the fairy. And Jem and their caretaker went inside. Now, in order to imagine the inside of this beautiful old fairy's house, you have to think purple. Everything was purple. Vibrant, deep, shining purple. The purple practically breathed. I think it had a pulse. The walls were purple. The inside of the door was purple. The carpets were purple. The chairs were purple. Jem was astonished and astounded and amazed. There was so much purple. It was beautiful. Jem and their caretaker followed the old fairy into the kitchen, and the old fairy said, "Now, do you want some tea?" And Jem said, "Oh, yes. Is it purple tea?" "Yes," said the fairy. "How did you know?" And Jem was like, "Oh, I just took a wild guess. You really like purple, don't you?" "I do," said the fairy. "It's the most beautiful color on the face of the planet." And then she lifted up a shining purple kettle and put it on the stovetop. Then she hopped over to the chair next to Jem, pulled it out, sat down, and said, "Now, tell me what you want." And Jem said, "I want claws and webs so I can crawl around and climb up and down like a spider and be able to play with the other sprites and play hide and seek and go visit my friends in their houses, except I don't have friends, but I think I could have them if I could have claws and webs." And the fairy looked very thoughtful for a minute. In fact, if you were paying close attention, She might have looked a little sad when Jem said that they didn't have friends. But she covered it up because grown-ups don't give their sadness to kids to hold. They hold it for themselves. And the old fairy said, "Well now, we'll just have to see about that." And that is where we leave them for this week. Well, not this week. I'll check back in on Tuesday with the next section of the story at about a few minutes after 8 o'clock.